I'm here today with Caroline Beidler. Caroline is the founder and managing editor of Bright Story Shine, a place to share and celebrate stories of recovery and resilience without judgment and without shame. They explore topics such as addiction, mental health and wellness, faith and spirituality, trauma recovery, sexual violence, stigma, and hope. Caroline is also the director of Creative Consultation Services, LLC, a business focused on creating sustainable addiction recovery support services at the local, state, and federal level. She's the past director of Wisconsin Voices for Recovery, along with past founder and director of ED2 Recovery, a nationally recognized program that brings recovery coaching into the emergency department setting. In 2015, she won the Texas Research Society on Alcoholism Science Education Award for her research on stigma and social support for recently deployed veterans. Her writing is featured on the Grit and Grace Project, In the Rooms, The Fix, the Addiction Technology Transfer Center, and on other websites. You can learn more about her organization at brightstoryshine.com and more about Caroline at carolinebeidler.com. So Caroline, thanks so much for joining us and congratulations on all of your amazing work.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. And it's always an interesting experience listening to the work that you've done, having your bio read. Sometimes I'm like, who is that person? I sound busy, but yes, it's been quite the journey so far.
Well, clearly you're passionate about this area and you've done a lot, to support people struggling through, the different types of issues that we discussed. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your background before we kind of get into your writing.
Absolutely. I would love to do that. So, I'm a woman in addiction and mental health recovery, and just going to forewarn you, we have a tendency to get a little bit deep and in sharing. And I want to do that because I think vulnerability is very important in writing, in life, and for my own personal story that has really propelled me forward and helped me heal so much. So I'm going to just get it out there. So like many of us, I grew up in a broken home. I experienced a whole number of different traumas. I'm not going to give you the list. It would take way too long. But ultimately, what I experienced growing up in a broken home and experiencing certain traumas led me down a path of escape and self-destruction, really. And I became addicted to drugs and alcohol at 14 years old. So very young.
Wow. That's really young.
So through that journey, I survived multiple experiences of sexual violence, overdose, just adding to kind of this, this mess, this very dark place. And through that, a couple decades later, I became a believer. And that conversion experience in my 20s, so I did not grow up in a Christian home. I was never baptized as a baby. I was baptized at 22 years old. Since that time, it was really kind of this moment of catapulting me into the world of faith and giving me a foundation to kind of build my healing on. I really started learning at that time too what Jesus meant, when he said we need to carry our crosses. I felt like I had been carrying a very heavy load for a really long time. But that experience of baptism was really significant for me. So early on in my faith journey, I still struggled for a long time though. And this is one of the things that I love to talk about in my writing and be very vulnerable about is, especially for someone like me who experienced so much trauma and, experienced addiction at such a young age, reconciling that experience of hardship and pain and struggle with a loving God, that I was hearing about in church and learning about, and I was supposed to be singing these praise songs. I was really having a hard time reconciling all of that. I also didn't know at the time I had undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder from everything. So interestingly, I love the way that God designs these moments of encounter with different folks. But I happened upon a book. So I also was an avid reader at this time. I think my post-traumatic stress kept me away from hanging out with people. I had some really good reading time built in there. But anyways, I happened upon a book just by chance called Where is God When It Hurts by Philip Yancey, which I'm sure you're very familiar with.
Yes, absolutely.
so interestingly, his reflections and stories, totally different. He's a journalist. He's, a very devout Christian and from a Southern Baptist upbringing. Here I am, a woman in early recovery, trying to find my way and figure out faith and all of these things. But something happened to me on a spiritual level that I was able to first see. And he was really, his writing really helped me see this, that my pain had a purpose. And so at that time in my mid-20s, I really started being able to see my experience in a new way. So instead of feeling angry at God, it was more about connecting with this idea of brokenness and suffering and seeing how it was also about redemption. And so, my journey through recovery and now as an author, authors like Philip Yancey, Johnny Erickson Tada, Henry Nouwen, Brennan Manning, all of these people really opened up a world of vulnerability for me. Sorry, you might hear my cat meowing. Gustav likes to make an appearance on my interviews.
That's quite all right. Cat or
so anyways,
animals and children are always welcome.
Yeah. So when I share my story, I love to talk about that, especially as a writer. The other writers who have had such an important impact on my spiritual journey, on my recovery journey, especially as I mentioned, someone outside of the church, what I really needed to be able to connect with faith was, I like to call it, and maybe someone else has too, but more of a conversational theology. It's not like someone preaching at me from a pulpit. It's not someone, looking down on my experience, but it's someone saying, hey, you know what? Doubting is 100% normal. Being skeptical, having this issue with, okay, God, what? You're loving, but also all of this pain, trying to reconcile that. Again, completely normal. So I know I'm all over the place here, but I think after having years of struggle, I was inspired by these authors and by others to not only start having honest conversations myself, but helping other women specifically through this process of recovery and introducing them to some of the same ideas that helped me.
If you could, like some of the organizations that I mentioned, in the beginning, when did you start, like, for instance, Bright Story Shine?
Sure. So absolutely. So, as I mentioned in my 20s, I was baptized. I had all of this amazing things happening in my heart through connecting with authors. And so I had a period of time where I just was able to have this reflection and solitude and really time with God. I feel like God was really preparing me. And then, really as I hit my late 20s, had several years of recovery under my belt, and into my 30s, I became very involved in kind of this missional ministry to folks who were hurting, to especially women who were hurting around the same issues that I had been hurting: addiction, trauma, sexual violence. And all of those things, by the way, are so connected for women in addiction recovery. It's another reason it's very important that, and one of the reasons I highlight it in my writing. So Bright Story Shine was another effort that I became involved in. Actually, after the pandemic hit, I had another kind of, I don't want to call it a rude awakening, spiritual awakening. I'm not sure. I know many of us have had this experience where we're kind of hit with, okay, now what? Now what? The world is going in this direction. What am I going to do with my time? How am I going to use it well? Like we kind of talked about before we started here. So I decided, one of the things that helped me along my journey is hearing stories from other women. I talked a little bit about this idea of radical vulnerability, or I talk a little bit about this in my writing, or a lot about it. But just being open and honest about my own personal story, hearing other women's stories gave me the hope that, what? I have the ability to change. We all have the ability to have these conversion kind of experiences, these monumental spiritual kind of experiences, and also those small things that happen in our hearts that help us go another way, walk another path. So Bright Story Shine was really born out of this kind of this purpose that it felt like God was just kind of reigniting in my heart. I was between jobs. Right now I'm at home. I have 2-year-old, they're 3 now. 3-year-old twins. So I spend most of my day caring for them, and it's amazing that I'm able to show up in that way. But Bright Story Shine is really just a platform for other women to talk about their stories, to highlight specifically the pathway of faith. Because a lot of times, if you're not in recovery, you may not be aware of this, but a lot of times the faith path, specifically the Jesus path, Christianity, isn't talked about. Faith is talked about in more subtle, higher power and things like that in order to be an inclusive space, which is, I love the fact that a lot of recovery circles are inclusive. And at the same time, I think a lot is missed when we don't share openly about our faith. So that's another piece. I'm trying to bridge that gap between the faith and recovery communities through that as well.
So you've written several different things. One of them I'd like to, ask you to talk about a little bit is an ebook called 10 Practical Ways to Make Your Recovery Shine. Can you tell us about that book and why you wrote it?
Sure, absolutely. Well, being able to engage with the women reaching out to me through Bright Story Shine, learning more about what other women, really need in terms of ways to reset and recharge recovery. I kept hearing the same thing over and over again, and that is practical tools, practical tips. I want you to show me not kind of this high level stuff, but really on a day-to-day basis, what can I do? What actions can I take to help my recovery shine, change, grow? And so I spent a lot of time in prayer and reflecting on my own story, talking to other women, and I put together a list of 10 practical ways, things like being creative, getting moving, movement, prayer, a whole number of different things, 10 different things, and going into a lot of detail around those to help give women like me and other women out there who might be, toying with the idea, hey, do I have a problem with drinking? Do I need to explore what addiction recovery is or mental health recovery? Because I'm not sure if you've been aware, I know there's been several articles, New York Times, lots of different places talking about since the COVID pandemic began, addiction rates and substance use issues have skyrocketed specifically for women. And there have been a number of reasons that researchers are asserting this is happening, increased pressures on women with work and school, homeschooling, and all of these things. Whatever the reason, it's happening. And so I think it's so timely, especially now that more resources are out there for women. And the other thing, I mentioned briefly, when I think about, my own experience in addiction recovery, women in addiction recovery or those who struggle with substance use issues, a lot of the time, most of the time have experienced some type of trauma. And research from the National Institute on Drug Abuse shows 80%, and I would argue after COVID, that number has increased, but 80% of women in addiction recovery have experienced some type of trauma. And for women, most often that is sexual trauma or violence. So again, there's just so many reasons why it's so important to get this information out there. And I recognize, we've got a number of, I guess the genre name now is quit lit, this quit literature. There's a number of books in this category that are coming out, recovery memoirs and those types of things, which is awesome, very needed. We need to hear those stories. And at the same time, I think these practical tips and tools are also extremely important, kind of translate our own experience of addiction recovery, what we learn from others, and really breaking it down, giving us a practical list. So I'm hoping that I've been able to do that in this free ebook.
Good. Well, it seems like, the timing is really apropos, as you mentioned, with the pandemic and all the other stresses going on. Mm-hmm. These issues have increased in magnitude. Do you think it's isolation? Do you think it's just overall chaos and stress? What do you think kind of some of the driving factors are behind this?
Well, I think researchers are trying to understand that a little bit better. I can speak to my own experience. So, when COVID started back in March of 2020, I actually was presenting at a conference in Washington, D.C. that first week of March. Then the next week, they basically shut the world down. So I ended up getting COVID. And now I believe it's they call it long COVID, but I was sick for several months with a variety of symptoms. And I started experiencing, not just through my own illness, but just this real anxiety around what's happening in the world? We didn't really understand it. We certainly didn't have the vaccines. There was a lot of unknowns, especially for, as a mom of, at that time, my twins were 18 months old. I mean, I was terrified. And, I think again, I can speak for my own experience in that state of crisis and unknown, I felt like I really had two ways to go, right? It was like, okay, either I can spiral down. I certainly had, experience spiraling down. I could go back to drugs and alcohol. I could go back to all of these unhealthy coping mechanisms. Or on the reverse side, I could choose, and I consciously did this. I chose, I remember having kind of this prayerful conversation with God and, basically really feeling like, okay, maybe my faith isn't as strong as I thought it was. If I can really be shaken to the core like this. So if this is the case, God, what am I going to do? What do I need to do to really be able to lean on you during times like this? I hope this is the last of what we're experiencing and that the world will heal from this. My mother's intuition, my gut says, oh, we might be experiencing more. I don't know. Who knows what's going to happen, right? But regardless of what is going to happen, like, can I lean on my faith? Can I lean on God? Can I truly trust in Jesus? And, so I was going through all of these things. And I think as a whole, maybe as women, people are having these crisis kind of moments, really having to determine, okay, where am I going to rest my faith and my trust in? And, for me, it can be a daily, sometimes moment by moment decision. I'm certainly not there 100% of the time. And I have doubts and I have, I'm actually rereading What's So Amazing About Grace and Reaching for the Invisible God. I'm going back and reading some books by Philip Yancey, but, God may not have verbally communicated back to me, but you know what? I feel like God gave me some solution in that, hey, I can find purpose in this. I started Bright Story Shine. Hey, I can talk about my experience of anxiety and struggle. I had to up my recovery program. I'm over a decade in recovery, but I needed to go back to some of the basics because I was struggling so much during COVID, as I mentioned. So just a little bit about my own experience. Again, I can't speak for everyone, but perhaps there's kind of this current of some of those same things happening for other women out there too.
So one of the authors that I worked for in the past is Frederick Beekner. And several years ago, he wrote about his view that AA meetings are much like what maybe the original church was like, and maybe much like what church maybe today should be. What are your thoughts in terms of how the church can support addiction recovery services, addiction recovery of individuals?
Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful question. And I love that so much. And as I mentioned, I reread What's So Amazing About Grace. Philip Yancey also speaks very eloquently about this as well. And interestingly, my agent is currently shopping a manuscript that I have out about this specifically, different ways that the recovery community can inform faith communities, because something beautiful happens in the recovery space. And I've told several people this before, but my first experience of this concept of radical vulnerability and honesty, which led me to healing, didn't happen in a church. It happened in a recovery meeting. And so there are things that happen in a recovery meeting that are raw and that are real. And I recommend, I say this to anyone, but if you haven't been to a recovery meeting, that could be a 12-step meeting. You may have heard of AA or NA, something like that. Celebrate Recovery. I highly recommend it, even if you don't struggle with anything, because the experience is incredible. So we come together and it's like the playing field is level, right? You could have business executives, you could have people experiencing homelessness, people in human trafficking with stay-at-home moms. We come around a table, usually an open circle, which in and of itself just signifies this openness and this vulnerability, this honesty, and we share, hi, I'm Caroline and I'm, a mess or whatever, however people identify. And that's where I've experienced one of the foundational verses I believe that leads to such healing in recovery spaces is James 5:16, right? Confess our sins to one another, pray for each other, and we will be healed. When we get it all out there, my dream would be, hey, I would love to see small groups veer in that direction, right? Let's sit in a circle and let's tell everyone the worst thing we've ever done, the worst thing that's done has been done to us, and just lay it out there and see what happens. Well, I've seen what's happened from doing that in recovery spaces, and it is miraculous. It is absolutely miraculous what can happen when people come together like that. So I think the church has a lot to learn from addiction recovery communities. And that's one of the things I highlight in my writing as well. I think the other piece, though, to be careful about, because I know personally I have a tendency, if something's wrong with me, I like to point fingers and say, well, this is wrong with you and this is wrong with you. I think that we can explore these topics, not in so much like, oh, hey, this is wrong with, the church, or you should be doing this, but what can we learn from each other? And one of the things I think that the recovery community also can learn from the church is this idea that, just because someone is in a pew on Sunday does not mean they have their life together. In fact, it means they don't, right? All of us are kind of on the same level playing field, whether we know it or not. And so I'd love to see the folks in the basement, of the church and the folks in the pews upstairs kind of come together, because, time is short, right? We don't, and I think that we all need that opportunity for healing. So a lot of what I do in my writing is trying to bridge that gap, so faith communities can learn from recovery communities and vice versa, because there's so much to share there. And as I mentioned too, it wasn't until I was connected with a recovery community that my own healing journey really started.
So maybe we need a faith anonymous movement, something like that.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Well, what are they? The ex-evangelicals, or I don't know, maybe someone wants to start something like that.
So you got a free virtual event coming up in March. Can you tell us about that?
I would love to. So anyone can go to my website, brightstoryshine.com. I'm organizing the first ever Women's Global Recovery Roundtable. I actually had a planning meeting this morning. We had women from Brazil, the UK. It's going to be phenomenal. It's interesting. I had this idea kind of planted in my mind, and started talking to women across the US, and then started connecting with women globally. And there is a lot of need right now for women to come together to talk about our recovery stories and talk about what works. Again, going back to those practical tools, because this isn't just isolated in the US. Women are struggling with substance use and addiction issues or trauma. This is happening on a global scale. So I'm really excited to bring together everyone at a virtual table to talk about this. It's completely free, so you can go ahead and register. So I'm excited to see what the day will bring. Hopefully this will be an annual event, but it will be speakers who are leaders in the addiction recovery field in the US and in other countries like Brazil, Africa, all over the place. You can check it out on my website. And I'm very excited. It's also going to be translated in 3 languages, so English, Spanish, and Portuguese as well, live translated.
Wonderful. That's very cool.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of our audience are writers. Can you talk a little bit about what your writing process looks like?
I would love to. So it has certainly evolved over time. I think I started off feeling like it was, I had to be in the right frame of mind and be in, have this inspired feeling, extremely caffeinated. I had to have all of the things, lined up. As I'm getting older, I'm going to be turning 40 here in about a month. What's really helpful for me is to be very regimented and very structured around my writing, and protect that time and make sure it's almost like exercising, right? It's like, okay, here's the time I'm going to be doing this, and kind of working out those muscles. And so just being constant with specific a writing schedule has been helpful. And also, the work that you've done with your platform, engaging with other types of resources that help support authors has been very, very helpful for me, because I learned so much from other people's experiences, and just feeling like, not so isolated in the process. Because when I started a couple of years ago writing, my first book and starting all of this with the platform, for me, well, initially it was all about the writing. And that was, and then getting the agent, I was checking off all the boxes, but I found that the writing piece is actually a pretty small percent of being an author. And so I'm learning how to step into that and embrace that. I think sometimes I'm like, oh, the platform building, but it's exciting because I get to connect with women now across the globe about an issue I care about. So I guess if I had advice for other writers out there like me, would just be to stay the course. Definitely, schedule some time for yourself that is strictly writing time and stay disciplined. And also, continue to connect and learn from other folks like yourself about, the best ways to approach writing and approach the writing career.
So as you well know, in today's world, marketing, your work is at least as important as developing the work itself. What do you do from a marketing perspective that you found to be most effective?
So that word, it kind of like, I don't know if it's the social worker in me or
marketing is not a dirty word. I try to tell everybody, it's not a dirty word.
I like to reframe it. I'm a fan of reframing things that I kind of have lived. But for me, marketing is really about connection and relationship. I think that, for me, I don't want to see it as marketing myself or marketing my ideas. Although there might be a measure of, having a brand and all of these, like there's another word that kind of gets me. But, for me, marketing is really about building a relationship and connecting with and engaging with my audience around something I care about. Ultimately I do what I do because I want to help people. I want to affect positive change.
I think that you just hit the nail on the head on the most important element of marketing, branding, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I know those are business terms, but at the end of the day, if your mission is to help other people, that's what matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Sometimes we have to kind of sift through that language and those concepts, marketing and platform and all of that, but kind of boil it down to that authentic, motivation, helping people, and then we can kind of sort out the rest as we go along. So.
Yeah. And so, describing as connecting and relationships, I think is really a positive thing. And I'm glad you are focusing on that and you see it that way.
Yeah, thank you.
So looking forward, are there any future projects beyond the virtual event in March that you want to tell folks about?
Well, I would love for anyone listening to get engaged with brightstoryshine.com. I'd love to hear from other folks about resources specifically to support women's addiction and mental health trauma recovery. And, I'm all about creating resources and I want to do those that can help the community out there. So I'd love to hear from folks about ideas that they might have, resources that they would like to see. As I mentioned, I'm working with my agent, getting a manuscript out there, and I'm just continuing on. I'm working on a devotional. I don't want to give too much away, a couple other things. So I'm really excited and I'm kind of all in, the writing author space right now. And I'm hoping to come out to Colorado also for your conference in June. I'm very excited about that. So I'm hoping that will be in person. So we'll kind of see how that works out. But yeah, that's kind of what I have going on. Just stay on the course and wanting to continue helping those out there who are struggling.
Excellent. Well, I love your passion and your enthusiasm and your determination, you know what I mean, to do this, to help others and to, do all the necessary steps in this long, persistent journey. So again, the name of the book, the one ebook that we talked about is 10 Practical Ways to Make Your Recovery Shine. And you can find out more about that at brightstoryshine.com. and CarolineBeidler.com. That's CarolineBeidler.com. So Caroline, again, congratulations on all your work and thanks so much for sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.